The cameras were rolling, the lights burning hot, and the debate hall buzzed with the restless hum of anticipation. Questions had been sharp all evening, but no one expected the venom that was about to cut through the air. Karoline Leavitt leaned forward, her voice curling with disdain, her lips shaping words that carried the sting of a slap. Go back to India. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to stop. The syllables didn't just echo in the chamber, they pierced it. Gasps erupted, then silence. An electric, suffocating silence. Every eye in the room flicked toward Kash Patel. His face remained steady, unreadable, but the weight of the insult pressed down like a storm cloud gathering over the stage. The cameras zoomed closer, searching for cracks, anger, humiliation, a stumble, anything. But Kash didn't blink. He sat anchored, the target of a remark meant to wound not just him, but the millions whose roots stretched beyond America's borders. In that pause, generations of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience seemed to hang between the insult and the response. Leavitt smirked, mistaking silence for surrender. The smirk widened, feeding off the tension in the room, as if she had landed the knockout blow. But the audience wasn't so easily convinced. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others folded their arms in disgust, and many simply stared, waiting, no, aching, for Patel to answer. The air was thick, almost cinematic in its stillness. The insult had not only been heard, it had been felt. And in that suspended moment, America itself seemed to lean in, ears straining, hearts pounding. Would he fire back in anger? Would he shrink beneath the weight of those words? Or would he do something no one expected? Every story has a turning point, and in that hall, the insult was not the end. It was the spark. A spark that would ignite Patel's calm fury, his unshakable truth, his refusal to be diminished. The crowd didn't know it yet. Karoline Leavitt didn't know it yet. But Patel was about to deliver an answer that would ripple far beyond those walls. Because nobody was prepared for how Kash Patel would respond. Karoline Leavitt was no stranger to sharp words. In fact, she had built much of her reputation on them. Young, brash, and eager to brand herself as the unapologetic voice of a new generation, she rose through the political ranks not with compromise, but with confrontation. Her fans praised her bluntness, but her critics saw a pattern of abrasiveness repackaged as authenticity, outrage passed off as courage. In the world of sound bites and viral clips, she had mastered the art of the jab, the insult that made headlines. And yet, this moment was different. This wasn't a calculated talking point about taxes or a sarcastic quip about policy. This was personal. It was the kind of line that didn't just strike at Kash Patel. It struck at the millions who had ever been told, in a classroom, at a workplace, in their own neighborhood, that they didn't truly belong. The sting of, "Go back to India," wasn't just a political slight. It was a dagger into the heart of identity, belonging, and Americanness itself. That was why the silence felt so heavy. The room knew it. The audience at home knew it. And deep down, perhaps even Leavitt knew it. Because this wasn't merely a test of two people standing at podiums. It was a referendum on what America chooses to reward: arrogance dressed as patriotism, or dignity rooted in sacrifice. The stakes rose higher with every passing second. This was not just about Kash Patel defending himself. It was about whether he could turn one of the oldest, ugliest taunts hurled at immigrants into something greater. It was about whether he could show the millions watching that dignity doesn't bend, that identity cannot be erased with a sneer, and that Americanness is earned not through ancestry, but through service and contribution. For Leavitt, the insult was meant as a weapon, a way to knock her opponent off balance and seize control of the room. But in her arrogance, she underestimated what those words carried. To many, they sounded less like strength and more like weakness, a lashing out from someone who had run out of substance. To others, they sounded like a challenge: would Patel, the son of immigrants, shrink under the weight of being told to go back? Or would he rise? And as the cameras panned between the two figures, the suspense became unbearable. Kash Patel remained still, his silence an armor, his eyes unblinking. Leavitt, sensing the unease, leaned back with that smirk again, mistaking discomfort for dominance. She didn't yet realize that the very insult she thought had ended the exchange was only the beginning of a larger reckoning. Because this wasn't just a debate. It was a test of values, a test of what America rewards. Would the audience, both in that room and across the nation, stand by arrogance born of privilege, or rally behind the dignity of an immigrant's son who had given his life to public service? The tension grew, coiling tighter with every second of silence. Leavitt's confidence swelled, as though she had cornered her opponent. But arrogance has a way of pushing too far, of failing to sense the tide turning beneath the surface. And as the tension built, the arrogance of the insulter only grew. To understand why Karoline Leavitt's words carried such venom, you have to understand the world she built around herself. She was not a quiet figure who stumbled into politics by accident. She crafted her brand deliberately, brick by brick, with outrage as the mortar. Young and ambitious, she styled herself as a rising star who could say what others were too afraid to say. And in a political climate where conflict became currency, Leavitt was determined to cash in. Her rise was swift. Straight from college into communications roles, then onto the national stage, she cultivated a reputation as a firebrand. She wore her abrasiveness like a badge of honor, as if harsh words were proof of courage. To her supporters, she was refreshing, unyielding, unapologetic. But to many others, her rhetoric exposed a troubling pattern. Her power came not from building bridges, but from burning them. This was not her first insult, nor her first attempt at cutting someone down with words meant to belittle. She had mocked opponents for their accents, for their backgrounds, for daring to disagree with her. She thrived on provocation, baiting her critics into outrage and then basking in the attention that followed. She called it truth-telling. Others called it cruelty. And yet, for all her bravado, contradictions followed her everywhere. She spoke often about patriotism, yet seemed to wield it as a weapon rather than a unifying principle. She extolled the virtues of American grit, but dismissed the very immigrant families whose labor and sacrifice built much of the country she claimed to defend. She declared herself a champion of free speech, yet bristled with indignation whenever critics challenged her own. One episode stood out vividly in the public's memory. During a heated town hall, a high school student nervously asked her about racial equality in America. Instead of answering with empathy or even policy, Leavitt laughed. She told the student they were buying into leftist lies, dismissing the teenager's lived experience as nothing more than propaganda. The crowd at that event split in two. Some cheered her dismissal, while others booed loudly, appalled by the mockery of a young voice seeking understanding. That clip spread online, dividing audiences even further, her fans emboldened, her critics horrified. In another instance, she boasted about being a fighter for the forgotten American. But when pressed on what that meant, she delivered only platitudes and insults against immigrants and minorities. Critics called it hypocrisy, a politician who claimed to protect the forgotten, while actively erasing the stories of millions who worked tirelessly just to belong. And this was the irony. Her brand thrived on the very division she claimed to heal. She presented herself as a warrior for American values, but what she projected was arrogance, dismissiveness, a willingness to belittle others to inflate herself. To those who saw through the veneer, her act wasn't strength. It was theater. Still, Leavitt rarely seemed to care about backlash. In fact, she often leaned into it. When critics accused her of crossing lines, she smirked and said she was only telling it like it is. When her words trended for all the wrong reasons, she would proudly repost the criticism, spinning outrage into proof that she had struck a nerve. She thrived on conflict, not resolution. And so, when she spat out the words, "Go back to India," it fit the pattern. It wasn't a slip of the tongue or a heat of the moment stumble. It was a performance. A calculated attempt to dominate the stage, to make herself look strong by cutting someone else down. But in that moment, arrogance blurred into overreach. For while insults had given her a platform before, this time the target was someone who embodied the very values she sought to undermine. The gasps in the debate hall were not just reactions to the words themselves, but to the audacity of them. Here was a young politician, eager to prove her toughness, crossing into territory that revealed less about her opponent and more about her own insecurity. It was the portrait of arrogance mistaken for strength, the hubris of someone convinced they were untouchable. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't realize, was that the man sitting across from her was not an ordinary opponent. He was not some green newcomer ready to crumble under pressure. He had been here before, many times. He had endured worse, faced sharper attacks, weathered storms that would have broken others. And so, as Karoline Leavitt basked in the moment she thought was her triumph, she was unknowingly setting the stage for her downfall. But little did she know, the man she tried to diminish had spent his entire life preparing for this very moment. To understand Kash Patel's stillness in that moment, the unflinching composure that followed an insult meant to reduce him, you have to travel back, long before the debate stage, to the quiet sacrifices that shaped him. His story is not one of privilege handed down, but of grit carried forward, one generation at a time. Patel's parents arrived in America with little more than hope stitched into their hearts. They worked long hours in small jobs, often invisible to the powerful, but essential to the fabric of everyday life. His father would return home with tired hands and an aching back, yet his pride was never dimmed. His mother, balancing work and family, told her son stories about perseverance, that in America, dignity was not given, it was earned. Those early lessons carved themselves into Kash's character. He grew up watching his parents sacrifice so that he could stand taller. When classmates mocked his name or questioned his heritage, he remembered the sacrifices that had built his future. When teachers underestimated him, he learned to exceed expectations not with anger, but with quiet resolve. He understood early that the path for someone like him would not be easy, but it would be possible, because his parents had proven it with every sacrifice they made. That resilience followed him into adulthood. After law school, Patel could have chosen a lucrative private career, but he leaned instead into public service. He worked as a public defender, standing beside those society had written off, fighting for fairness in rooms where few voices spoke for the forgotten. Later, in roles at the highest levels of government, he became a trusted hand in matters of intelligence and security. It was not glamorous work, and it often came with bruises, political smears, public attacks, attempts to question his loyalty. But time and again, Patel answered with calm persistence. He didn't lash out. He simply kept showing up, armed with facts, grounded in dignity. And this is what made his presence on that debate stage more than symbolic. He was not a man who stumbled into politics chasing cameras. He was a man forged by years of service, someone who knew the sting of being questioned, the challenge of carrying an immigrant name into rooms where it didn't belong, and the strength it took to hold steady when arrogance tried to drown out truth. What critics often failed to see was Patel's humanity. Away from the spotlight, he was known for his humility, for remembering staff by name, for treating strangers with respect. He wasn't a man intoxicated by the sound of his own voice. He was a man who listened, who valued conversation, who found strength not in belittling others, but in holding firm to facts and principles. Even his adversaries, pressed in private, would admit he had a steadiness they couldn't shake. This steadiness wasn't weakness. It was discipline. Patel had learned that dignity carries further than rage, that silence can be louder than shouting. And in a nation increasingly divided by who yells the loudest, his calm was its own form of rebellion. He embodied something deeper than political theater. He embodied the American ideal that service, sacrifice, and truth matter more than arrogance or privilege. That is why the insult struck the room so sharply. Go Back to India was not just an attack on Patel's identity. It was an erasure attempt against a man who had given more to America than many who questioned him. He wasn't a stranger to the values of this country. He was living proof of them. His parents had planted the seeds. He had carried them forward. And now, under the bright lights, that legacy was being challenged not by reason, but by arrogance. The irony was bitter and yet poetic. Here stood Karoline Leavitt, wielding an insult she thought would diminish him, while across from her stood a man whose very life contradicted it. Patel's journey wasn't about privilege or shortcuts. It was about climbing, falling, climbing again, and never surrendering to the easy bitterness of hate. If America was truly about opportunity, about resilience, about giving back more than you take, then Kash Patel was its embodiment. That is what the audience felt in that silent pause. Even before he spoke, even before his words would shake the room, there was a recognition that Patel had been here before. Not in this hall, not under these lights, but in the countless invisible battles fought by immigrants and their children. He had faced down the stares, the whispers, the doubts, and yet he stood, steady as ever. So when that insult landed, Patel did not flinch. He leaned into his lifetime of battles. The silence that followed the insult should have been a warning, but Karoline Leavitt didn't recognize it. Instead of retreating, she pressed forward, her smirk widening as though the sting of her words had given her the upper hand. She leaned back toward the microphone, her voice carrying that sharp, mocking edge she had perfected. "See, this is the problem," she said, scanning the room with a smug glance. "People like him want to lecture us about America, but they'll never understand what real Americans stand for." A ripple went through the audience. Part gasp, part nervous laughter. A few clapped, emboldened by the brazenness, but the majority shifted uneasily in their seats. Some shook their heads, others crossed their arms in silent protest. The mood was no longer electric, it was tense, like a wire pulled too tight, threatening to snap. Still, Leavitt doubled down. "You can dress it up in service titles, in fancy resumes, but at the end of the day, you can't change where you come from. And no matter how hard you try, you'll never erase that." Her words were sharp, meant to cut deeper, to drive Patel into a corner where frustration might force him to stumble. But across the stage, Kash Patel remained perfectly still. His hands rested calmly on the podium. His expression betrayed nothing, not anger, not fear, not even irritation. The contrast was striking. Leavitt's body language was restless, animated, aggressive, while Patel's stillness seemed almost unshakable. The cameras caught every detail. They lingered on Leavitt's sneer, then cut to Patel's composed face, then back to the restless crowd. Commentators watching from home were already drafting their takes. But in the hall, the energy belonged to Patel. People could feel something brewing. Even if he had not yet said a single word, Leavitt noticed the shift, though she misread it. Mistaking Patel's calm for weakness, she leaned in once more, voice dripping with condescension. "What's the matter, Kash?" "Nothing to say. Cat got your tongue." Her laughter rang out, brittle against the uneasy air. The crowd didn't laugh with her. Instead, a low murmur swelled. Boos from the back rose, groans from the front. The nervous chuckles had dried up. What had been bold now felt cruel, what had sounded sharp now rang hollow. The very arrogance Leavitt believed was her strength was beginning to corrode the stage beneath her feet. And through it all, Patel stood like stone. His silence was no retreat, it was preparation. Those who knew his character recognized it immediately. He wasn't rattled, he wasn't broken. He was waiting, gathering, letting the moment ripen until the weight of his words could land with devastating force. Even the moderators, sensing the imbalance, hesitated before cutting in. They looked toward Patel, as if to offer him the floor, as if to signal that it was finally his turn to answer. The audience leaned in. The tension was unbearable now, each second of silence stretching longer than the last. You could hear shuffling in the seats, a cough echoing from the back row, the creak of a chair as someone leaned forward. Everyone knew what was coming, though no one knew exactly how it would sound. And then, with a pause so long the room could hear its own heartbeat, Patel began to speak. Kash Patel finally leaned toward the microphone. The room, already heavy with silence, seemed to fold in on itself. Every movement froze, the shifting of papers, the restless coughs, even the faint hum of the lights above. For the first time that night, it felt as though nothing existed outside this exchange. His voice broke the stillness. Calm, controlled. But each syllable carried a weight that seemed to press down on every corner of the hall. "I was born here." The words cut through the air like steel. Simple, unadorned. There was no anger in his tone, no need for theatrics. He spoke as though reciting a truth so obvious it needed no defense. A few gasps rippled across the room. Leavitt's smirk faltered, the first crack in her carefully constructed armor. Patel didn't stop. He straightened his shoulders, his eyes locked on hers, steady as stone. "I've served this country more than most who've ever questioned me." The statement rang with quiet thunder. It was not boastful, it was factual. He let it hang in the air, giving space for the words to land where they would. On the faces of veterans in the audience, there was a flicker of recognition. On the faces of young immigrants watching from the crowd, there was pride swelling in their chests. Leavitt tried to interject, but her voice caught against the rising tide of murmurs and whispers. She looked around, suddenly aware that the crowd was no longer with her. Her earlier confidence now looked like overreach, her arrogance exposed in sharp relief against Patel's unshakable composure. Patel continued, each line more deliberate than the last. "My parents came here with nothing. They worked jobs you wouldn't take. They sacrificed so I could stand here, on this stage, under these lights. And I ask you, Ms. Leavitt, what part of that story is un-American?" A wave of applause broke out from the back of the room, spreading quickly like fire catching dry grass. Patel didn't smile, didn't break focus. He remained calm, letting the reaction wash over without needing to stoke it. The applause wasn't for theatrics, it was for truth. He pressed on. "You tell me to go back. But I never left. I was born in this country. I've defended it in courts, in government, in service you will never know. And while you spend your time tearing down others to build yourself up, I've spent my life building something bigger than myself. That is what it means to be American." By now, the audience was fully his. Heads nodded, hands clapped, voices shouted approval. Each word chipped away at the false bravado Leavitt had tried to wield. She looked smaller with every passing second, her smirk gone, replaced by a stiff unease. Patel's cadence remained steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sneer. His restraint was the power. "You talk about patriotism. Let me tell you what patriotism looks like. It looks like parents who scrub floors so their children can study in the library. It looks like immigrants who fight in our military, who die wearing this nation's uniform. It looks like people who believe that America is not about where you come from, but about what you give." The hall erupted again. Cheers louder now, applause rolling like thunder. The cameras caught it all, the faces lit with pride, the students standing to clap, the veterans saluting with quiet respect. Patel paused, letting the noise crest and fall before speaking again. When he did, his words landed like a final hammer blow. You told me to go back. But maybe it's time you looked forward. Forward to an America that isn't defined by insults or arrogance, but by dignity, sacrifice, and truth. Forward to an America where no child ever has to hear that they don't belong in the only home they've ever known. That was the breaking point. The applause became a roar, wave after wave of standing ovations rippling through the crowd. Even those who had sat in silence earlier were now swept into the moment, clapping, cheering, shouting his name. The hall had transformed from a debate stage into something else. A reckoning. Leavitt stood rigid, her face pale under the lights. Her attempt to dominate the stage had collapsed, her smirk erased, her composure shattered. Cameras lingered on her as she tried to muster a reply, but no words came. Every second of her silence was another blow, another visible sign of defeat. Meanwhile, Patel remained calm, almost serene. He didn't pump his fist, didn't bask in the ovation. He simply stood there, hands resting on the podium, as if to remind everyone that this wasn't about theatrics. It was about truth. And truth didn't need volume. It needed conviction. As the applause swelled again, he lowered his gaze for a moment, almost contemplative. Then he looked up, scanning the crowd with eyes that seemed to hold both pride and humility. He had answered the insult not with rage, but with a reminder of what America could be at its best. In that hall, something had shifted. The insult that was meant to humiliate had become the very platform for Patel's most powerful statement yet. The man who had been told to go back had stood firmly in place, proving with every word that he belonged. Not just in the room, but in the story of America itself. The moderators struggled to restore order, their voices barely audible over the cheering. Commentators in the media booths whispered in disbelief, already drafting headlines that would capture the viral moment. Phones lit up in the crowd as clips were recorded, live, streamed, and shared in real time. And Leavitt. She remained frozen, realizing too late that her arrogance had detonated beneath her feet. What she thought would be her triumph had become her undoing, and the world was watching it unfold in real time. The debate had shifted, the story had changed, and Kash Patel had delivered a counterattack that would echo far beyond that room. But the real shock wasn't what happened in that room. It was what happened next across America. The moment Patel delivered his calm, but devastating counterattack, the debate hall seemed to vibrate with energy. Applause thundered, but the real shockwaves were only beginning. Within minutes, as attendees uploaded clips to TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, the scene spread like wildfire. By the time Patel stepped off the stage, Stand With Patel was already climbing into the trending charts. Social media thrives on spectacle, but it also thrives on authenticity. Patel's response had both. Users clipped the exact moment he said, "You told me to go back, but I never left." The soundbite turned into a rallying cry, stitched into memes, remixes, and inspirational edits. TikTok teens layered it over cinematic music. Veterans reposted it with captions like, "This is what service looks like." Immigrant families recorded videos of their children watching Patel's speech, eyes wide with pride. Within hours, millions had seen it. The comment sections were flooded with praise. "This is the America I believe in." Patel didn't just win the debate. He won the room, the internet, and the country. Dignity always outlasts arrogance. Leavitt, meanwhile, became the punchline. Screenshots of her frozen expression, eyes wide, smirk erased, circulated with mocking captions. "When the clapback is stronger than your whole platform." Meme accounts compared her to a cartoon villain, caught monologuing too long before defeat. Even some of her own political allies distanced themselves, quietly acknowledging on cable panels that her attack had backfired spectacularly. What stunned observers wasn't just the flood of grassroots support, but the unexpected voices joining in. A late-night comedian opened his monologue with Patel's clip, saying, "This is the first time in history a mic drop actually sounded like freedom ringing." A country music star tweeted, "Doesn't matter if you're red or blue. Truth like that deserves respect." Even rival politicians who had sparred with Patel in the past admitted on record that his dignity was the kind of example we need right now. The debate wasn't just replayed. It was reframed. Cable news split, screened Patel's poised remarks beside Leavitt's sneer, running endless loops of the exchange. Panelists marveled at how he had taken the lowest form of attack and elevated it into a teaching moment about identity and belonging. One anchor summarized it perfectly. Leavitt tried to erase him with 4 words. Patel answered with a lifetime of truth. For Patel's supporters, the viral moment was more than a debate highlight. It became proof of something deeper. The idea that resilience and grace could still triumph in a climate of division. Hashtags like "Forborn Hair" and "Fay American Values" shot up alongside "Stand With Patel." The internet turned his speech into a collective affirmation. Belonging wasn't up for debate. Dignity wasn't negotiable. Leavitt's team scrambled to control the narrative. They released statements claiming her words had been taken out of context. But the damage was done. No one was interested in excuses. The clips were too clear, too raw. Every time they tried to reframe it, another viral edit would surface, hammering the moment deeper into public consciousness. The scale of the reaction was something few had predicted. Patel, who had been a recognizable figure, but not a household name, suddenly found his face on morning shows, talk radio, podcasts, and opinion columns. A conservative magazine called him the steady hand America forgot it needed. A progressive commentator, usually critical of Patel, admitted, when someone takes an insult meant to divide and turns it into a statement of unity, you have to respect it. The story transcended politics. It became cultural. Families gathered around kitchen tables to replay the clip. Teachers brought it up in civics classes. Pastors mentioned it in sermons about dignity and perseverance. Patel had become more than a debater or political figure. He had become a symbol. And perhaps the most striking part, it wasn't Patel's resume or credentials that caught fire. It was his restraint, his calm, his choice to respond without venom. In a world addicted to outrage, his refusal to lash out became the very thing that electrified millions. Leavitt, once confident in her brand of sharp, edged rhetoric, found herself diminished, reduced to trending jokes and scathing op-eds. Patel, by contrast, stood elevated, not because he demanded it, but because America gave it to him. The debate had ended, but the movement had only begun. Online petitions urged Patel to speak at universities. Crowds requested him for town halls. His inbox flooded with messages from immigrants, veterans, parents, and students. Thank you for standing tall when they tried to make you small. And yet, for Patel, the moment wasn't about personal glory. Those who knew him said he wasn't celebrating the memes or chasing the spotlight. He was already thinking about the next step, how to turn a personal defense into a universal message. Because Patel understood something that few did. Insults fade, but dignity echoed. And then Patel took it one step further, transforming an insult into a universal message. In the days after the debate, the noise of politics churned on, but Patel's words refused to fade. The clip didn't just travel. It resonated, because it offered something so rare in modern discourse: clarity, dignity, and moral strength. Where others saw a cheap insult, Patel had uncovered an enduring truth. He distilled it simply. Americanness is not about where you're from, but what you give. Those words became a headline, a tweet, a quote on posters and digital billboards. But more importantly, they became a mirror, forcing Americans to ask themselves what kind of nation they wanted to be. Was it one that measured belonging by ancestry, or one that measured it by service, sacrifice, and contribution? Patel's life embodied the answer. His parents had arrived with little, but gave everything to build a future. He had served in roles most Americans couldn't name, but relied upon for their safety. His story wasn't an exception to the American promise. It was the proof of it. And in exposing that, Patel revealed the poverty of Leavitt's insult. Her words carried the weight of arrogance. His response carried the weight of history. The moral was as sharp as it was undeniable. Arrogance tries to diminish, but dignity outlasts. Privilege can sneer, but service silences. Commentators tried to summarize why the moment had cut so deep, and the consensus became clear. Patel didn't just defend himself. He defended an idea of America that people wanted to believe in again. He reminded the nation that identity was not something to weaponize, but something to honor. That true patriotism was not loud, not cruel, but steady, quiet, and resolute. For immigrant families, it was validation. For veterans, it was recognition. For ordinary citizens wary of division, it was a reminder that character still mattered. His message reached across lines that political talking points could never cross, because it wasn't a talking point. It was lived truth. Patel himself reflected on it later in an interview. You can tell someone to go back all you want. But when you've built your life here, when you've given your service here, when you've sacrificed here, where exactly is back? The only direction I know is forward. Those words struck even deeper, crystallizing the lesson. Americanness wasn't a birthright of the privileged few. It was earned, day by day, by those willing to give more than they took. And in that framework, Patel stood taller than the insult meant to cut him down. The debate moment became something larger than itself because it reminded people of the power of restraint, of calm, of letting truth do the heavy lifting. Patel didn't roar. He didn't lash out. And that quiet composure amplified the force of his message. In an era where outrage often drowns out reason, he showed that dignity could still command the room. It was no longer about Patel versus Leavitt. It was about what America chose to reward: the sneer or the service, the arrogance or the dignity. And in that choice, audiences made their decision clear. Students quoted Patel in essays. Parents used his words to guide conversations with their children about respect. Faith leaders echoed his message in sermons about humility and belonging. His response had transcended politics and moved into the realm of cultural wisdom. And so the lesson was written not just on screens, but in hearts. Americanness is measured by what we give, not by where we're told we should go. Leavitt's insult will be remembered, but not for the reason she intended. It will live as a foil, a failed attempt to belittle, that instead illuminated the strength of the person she attacked. Because when history tells this story, it won't linger on the sneer. It will remember the answer, the steady voice that turned cruelty into clarity, arrogance into humility, insult into inspiration. And that's why this moment will be remembered. Not for the insult, but for the dignity that silenced it. Karoline Leavitt tried to reduce Kash Patel to a punchline. She thought a cheap insult, "Go back to India," would leave a mark. But instead, it was her own arrogance that was exposed, because Patel didn't just answer her. He shocked America with the clarity of his dignity. This wasn't about two people on a stage. It was about what America chooses to value. Do we reward sneers or do we honor service? Do we define belonging by ancestry or by contribution? Patel's response reminded us all that Americanness isn't measured by privilege. It's measured by what you give. And that's why his moment went viral. Because it wasn't just Patel standing tall. It was every immigrant family who built something from nothing. It was every worker who gave more than they received. It was every American who still believes that dignity outweighs arrogance. That's the moral clarity. We can't afford to forget. Insults fade, but dignity lasts. Arrogance crumbles, but service endures. And Patel showed the nation which one deserves to win. So if you believe voices like his need to be heard, don't let this moment stop here. Subscribe now. Join the movement where dignity always wins. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of what true Americanness looks like. And in the comments, tell us what dignity means to you. Because this isn't just Patel's story, it's America's. The sneer will be remembered, yes. But only because of the answer that silenced it. And if enough of us carry that answer forward, this moment will outlive the insult, and remind the world dignity always wins.